things. So actually, in the long run,
it's more intimate.
In the long run, it was all actually better for that.
The booth.
Yeah, I like booths. Are we ready?
Are we good? Okay, thank you everybody for coming to our third PAR panel event here at CIIS. It's been a really great turnout these past 3 sessions. Thank you all for coming. We did one panel on politics and pluralism. We did another one on philosophy, spiritual inquiry as philosophical exercise.
No, it's the other way around. Philosophical inquiry is spiritual exercise.
Philosophical inquiry as spiritual exercise. It was my panel, I should know that. It was a really good panel. I don't know if I can remember that. Today we're doing metaphysics and religion after modernity. I'm going to say a little bit more about what that means in a second. But first I want to introduce our panelists and our faculty respondent. Over here we have Emily Wright. Emily is a PhD candidate in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program here at CIIS. She received her MSc in Neuroscience from the University of College London and Ecole Normale Supérieure in Paris, and her primary research focus centers on neurophenomenology. To my left here we have William Dowling. William Dowling received a bachelor's in science from the University of Colorado at Boulder for applied math with a concentration in biology. He's currently finishing up his 2nd year in the PCC master's program. He'll be graduating from CIIS in the spring of 2019 and is currently applying to PhD programs in the areas of philosophy and science. Next to him we have Ashton Cole Arnoldy. Ashton is also completing his MA in PCC, and his research interests include cosmopoetics. To my right here we have our faculty respondent, Dr. Jake Sherman. Jake Sherman is assistant professor and core faculty. Associate professor. This is what your bio says on the website.
I've been trying to get it changed for months.
Can't get any help around here. Jake Sherman is associate professor and core faculty in philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he's the co-director of the still current.
None of that's current.
None of this is current. Okay.
And
well,
I'm chair of
we'll
PCC,
skip to your previous accomplishments, which I hope are still true. He received his PhD in philosophical theology from the University of Cambridge, true or false?
More or less.
And he holds master's degrees in interdisciplinary studies and philosophy and religion from Regent College and CIIS, respectively. So today, our panelists and our faculty respondent are going to be speaking about metaphysics and religion after modernity. Is metaphysics something worth thinking about today in the 21st century, or is it a relic of an age well left behind? For over 200 years now, philosophers from Hume and Kant and Carnap to Nietzsche and Heidegger have repeatedly claimed that the age of metaphysics, like the age of religion to which it is closely tied, is over. We have, they insist, freed ourselves from superstition. We have become a post-metaphysical people. But are we really beyond metaphysics? What would that mean? And should we even want to be? The great questions about the nature of being, what it means to be, what being longs for, hopes for, desires, the good, the true, the beautiful, even God. The great questions of metaphysics may not be so easily dismissed. Schopenhauer claims that the human is a metaphysical animal. And in recent decades, an increasing number of cutting-edge philosophers from across the philosophical spectrum have sought both to revive and to revise metaphysics, not only as a strand of philosophical inquiry, but as essential to the task of making sense of our current crises. This panel seeks to engage this conversation by raising questions about the viability of metaphysics today, the role of metaphysics vis-a-vis science, the place of contemplative practices in renewed metaphysical inquiry, and other such matters. Throughout, we aim to keep open the question, is there a place for the renewal of metaphysics in our own day and time? So we're going to give each panelist just 20 minutes to give us some of their thoughts on the topic. They may speak for 15 to 20 minutes or so, at the end of which you'll have some time to answer some, or to ask some quick questions. We're going to move through each panelist, then have a little break. Jake, Dr. Sherman will then respond to the panel, and after Dr. Sherman's response, we're going to open it up to everybody for a more long-form collective conversation about the material. So I'm going to give you now to William Dowling.
Great. Thanks, Adam. My talk today is going to cover, with pretty broad brushes, philosophy and science. And just for clarification, metaphysics I'm taking to be very simply the meaning of the whole. And so, of course, this must include not just material phenomenon, but it must include the human experience. And it's mainly for this reason that I think it's a topic that we can never fully negate. Now, when I'm referring to science, sometimes it'll be somewhat idealistically in terms of what science is supposed to be, and sometimes as the popular interpretation of science, so the modern scientific view. Now, this is always inevitably going to be a bit of a caricature, but in order to speak about the topic, it's necessary to simplify sometimes. So the three questions I want to cover are, number one, does modern science negate metaphysics? Two, does science already do metaphysics? Number three, why is there so much antipathy in the modern scientific view towards metaphysics? And then lastly, I want to address the possible union of religion and science, and if that's even something we would want to accomplish. So beginning with the question, does modern science negate metaphysics? I've come to the recognition that even if our experience is nothing but an illusion, it may still be very significant metaphysically, ontologically. For instance, even if our own free will, our experience of love, our experience of purpose, our experience of questioning the nature of being, even if we take science at its face value and accept, which most of us are unwilling to do, but let's say, hypothetically, we're going to accept that science is going to achieve the theory of everything, that everything is determined by basic principles that are laid out in the language of mathematics, and that everything that we experience as free will, as love, as questioning the nature of being is nothing but an illusion. That would nonetheless mean that we live in a universe in which there are beings, there exists the phenomena of even the illusion of love, even the illusion of selfless, Christ-like love, or agape, or even the illusion of questioning the nature of being. That would be quite a fact of the universe, no matter where our stance is in terms of the reality of free will, the reality of does science already do metaphysics? I want to argue that as soon as science steps out of its proper boundaries, it is doing metaphysics. And by that, I mean science, idealistically speaking, is always restricted to a subsystem, an isolated subsystem. You have to experiment on a controlled environment, controlled phenomena, and you have to necessarily exclude everything else around that. So you cannot do science, you cannot do a scientific experiment on the whole universe, for instance. And so as soon as we take conclusions from experiments that are done within a limited purview, and we take those conclusions and apply them to the whole, we are leaving the realm of science and we are necessarily entering into the realm of metaphysics. The laws of physics do not have meaning on their own, and either they only have limited applicability based on measurable quantities, or they have a meaning for the whole. And by that, I mean math and the mathematical language that we're using to lay out the laws of physics, they, on their own, really don't have a lot of significance if you think about them just in a vacuum. And so when we look to science as a popular view of science, we're looking to our science writers to tell us about the nature of reality as such. And in order to do so, you have to take these laws of physics and you have to project a lot of meaning, a lot of holistic meaning to them. And as I was saying, once you extend their meaning to the whole of the universe, you're no longer doing science, you're necessarily doing metaphysics. And that is a huge leap to go from the hypotheses that can be verified to holistic, universal principles of the entire universe and of existence as a whole. Now, it is paradoxical that modern mechanistic science, any science, it depends upon human agency, even while perhaps denying it. Einstein's dream was to explain the universe from the ground up, to construct the entire edifice of the natural world from basic mathematical principles. And when we talk about reductionism, I see it not necessarily as taking the whole and then reducing it to the parts, but rather trying to construct the whole from the elementary parts. The scientists must, and this is what I mean by depending on human agency while denying perhaps free will, which is relatively common in some views of modern science. Scientists must seek knowledge, actively seek it. They must create instruments with which to measure nature. They have to consciously manipulate substances and energy and organisms. And to have a metaphysic that denies their very agency in doing so is essentially schizophrenic in a way. It's paradoxical and it's schizophrenic. And furthermore, perhaps more importantly, it results in like an ethical get out of jail free card. If ultimately we are determined by equations, ultimately we don't have responsibility for our actions. And I think that one of my main conclusions is going to be that the reason science must accept its limited purview is that it's ethically irresponsible not to. To have a view of the universe, to propose a view of the universe in which humans are nothing but atoms bouncing against one another with, via deterministic laws, is ethically irresponsible. While I don't think we can prove that humans have agency, and we can't prove that the world is more than the mathematical equations that we've discovered to be at the heart of matter, it's a choice. And I believe that we need to make the choice of recognizing what we already recognize in our daily lives. We already recognize in our daily lives that we do have agency. Even the most extreme skeptic or materialist, their spouse, their friends, their family will not accept the excuse that they are just a mess of deterministic particles. We expect from other human beings a certain ethical responsibility. And I think that's one of the most important aspects, I think, and one of the most important and dangerous consequences of a modern scientific view that purports to explain the whole from the bottom up, and necessarily then from lifeless, eternal mathematical equations. Why is there such an antipathy of science towards metaphysics? I feel that there is a not unjustified fear of a slippery slope, that once we admit any kind of purpose into the mix, we, to put it curtly, eventually you have to admit some notion of God. And I think that historically we have, science is coming from origins from the Enlightenment, in which science was championed as a political equalizer and a tool of the humanist project. And we're not ready to let this go. We have, there's still this fear, and maybe it's like a generational intrinsic fear, that if we allow this slippery slope in, if we allow purpose into our understanding of science, and our understanding of phenomena, moreover, that it'll just open the Pandora's box of uncertainty, and anything can come into that. Dangerous and oppressive religious superstitions that we broke free from. At least that's the maybe simplistic story that we broke free from in the Enlightenment. This, I want to mention this slippery slope in regards to, so Kant, I think, is very relevant still here, because in the Critique of Judgment, he mentions how biology, for instance, specifically biology, that you can't speak about biology and you can't speak about living organisms without using at least the concept of purpose. And he argues that proper science, while you must use that concept as a heuristic device, you can't admit it into, you can't admit that it is, or prove that it's ontologically valid, that it's ontologically real. Because once you do, it never ends. Like, if there's a purpose, then what's the purpose of that? And what's the purpose of that? And what's the purpose of that? And the whys eventually result in you having to look to some sort of level of divinity or something more than human. And this is, I think this is significant when we look to, because really it just takes a small step of admitting that we do have agency, and as humans. And once we do that, then all of a sudden we have this juxtaposition between humans and matter. And if we have agency and we admit that we're most likely then in that case not the end result of nature and of evolution, then at some point you're going to have to admit to higher levels of existence, of divinity, of God. Should we unite science and religion? I would say no, not necessarily unite the two. Science is a tool. We cannot look to this limited tool as the ultimate authority for metaphysical questions. And I think that today it's almost unfairly been placed in that role. That we've been looking, like, popularly for science writers to explain the universe based on quantum mechanics and the like. I think that science as a tool pertains to mostly matter, the level of the cosmos, religion, and so this is a tool for the material world, how to interact and use the material world to our benefit. In religion, you're looking at God and the divine, and these are tools in religion for our inner life, for our own spiritual practices. Philosophy, I see as kind of completing the Trinity and trying to blend the two and trying to figure out our place in the whole scheme. Thank you.
Do we have any immediate questions? No? Okay, then we're going to move on to Emily.
So I'm going to talk about today for our generation and in this culture, how we categorize religion, spirituality, contemplation, and how that ties in with science and neuroscience, and what are the effects of articulating these practices and concepts through the worldview of scientific naturalism. So I guess, I'm speaking from for myself a lot of the time when I talk about these things, and I'm aware that I myself have grown up in a certain culture that and have inhabited a secularized worldview, and there is a lot of people in our culture self-identify as spiritual but not religious, and without really knowing what that means, and engage in contemplative practices in a secularized form. And this is I'm speaking of this in terms of a sort of a very largely white, secular, educated, socially advantaged, cultural, social group for whom mainstream religions have largely lost their appeal and are often seen as problematic, or there's a suspicion around them. They're often seen as, well, for me and my upbringing, I feel that religions are often seen as requiring commitments to belief systems that are no longer viable, and that there's spiritual understandings of salvation and spiritual liberation are no longer relevant to our material needs and mode of being that are prevalent in our time. So, I mean, and before I go on, I'd also like to say that I also come from the UK, which is slightly different culturally than here. I think in the US it's more conventionally religious. And although in the UK there's still an important relationship between the church and the state, and also compared to continental Europe, I would say that the UK is slightly more empirically driven as opposed to theoretically inclined like the rest of Europe. So this is also just where I'm coming from in my own journey. So what has occurred for many people for whom aren't sort of view mainstream Western religious traditions as unviable and implausible, but they're still searching for some kind of orientation to life that brings a sense of meaning and purpose, which scientific naturalism fails to provide oftentimes. And they're looking for a sort of renewed spirituality beyond these mainstream religions. And the form that it has taken, as we all know, is this huge, widespread popularity of yoga, meditation, and martial arts, and these contemplative traditions. Mainstream Western religions have largely lost touch with their contemplative roots, but they do still exist in certain monastic settings. But when we think of contemplation today, we often think of Eastern wisdom traditions, and we also somehow see them as somewhat not religious. We've extracted these particular contemplative traditions and techniques out from the original religious contexts of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Shinto, from which they were originally embedded and maintained and refined, and we've appropriated them to our scientific worldview. And so these practices are now often seen as more as therapeutic techniques than they are religious engagements. And even when they're seen as a way of life or as a philosophy or as a spiritual discipline, we are still largely regarding the issue of religion as irrelevant or problematic. And so the secularization of these practices can also be seen as a sort of individualization of belief. And they're seen as individual techniques to improve health and well-being, and to bring back as an orientation of a shared ethics or of purpose and meaning in that sense. So I'd like to sort of argue how this this way of thinking about contemplation is particular to the cultural and institutional conditions of a formerly imperial European capitalist democracy, and it's the same tendencies and proclivities and way of thinking that also create the category of religion. So the notion of religion has been primarily about individual belief and ritual, and instead of religion being about social and ethical and liturgical conduct, so being about orthodoxy instead of orthopraxy, is a kind of modern construct, and it's been given the aura of credibility, intellectual credibility, by a lot of modern thinkers and public voices such as Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker, Pascal Boyer, to name a few. But sociologists such as Emile Durkheim and Max Weber, and more contemporary sociologists such as Peter Berger, and also specialists in the field of the history of religion, would contest this notion. And they see religion as being more, you can't separate religion, you can't see religion as a separable sphere of life away from politics, economics, and even from science. So therefore, asking whether science and religion are compatible makes no sense. The concept of religion, I'll just, a couple of these historians, people that are specialized in the history of religion, such as Talal Assad, Brent Longbury, and Jonathan Z. Smith. And they demonstrate that the concept of religion emerges from a certain social, political, and colonial context, and so therefore also the notion of secular comes along with that. And so instead of thinking about religion as individual belief, if we want to really understand religion, we have to look at how it functions in the larger context of social groups and social dynamics. And an individual and the individual beliefs emerge out from a larger social, cultural structure that's maintained through relationships and conversation. And without this larger social dynamical structure, there is no individual. So that larger structure also isn't amenable to introspective inquiry, because it's what makes introspection possible in the first place. So, and then Peter Berger talks about these kinds of ideas from Peter Berger, who talks about religion as a sacred canopy that functions as a sort of homeostatic regulation that's individual sense of self or personhood. So therefore, if we want to really understand what we're doing when we're engaging in these contemplative practices, we also have to look at what is our social, cultural scaffolding from which we have a sense of self. And a very important narrative for our time is the scientific narrative, and also the neuroscientific narrative, in the way that the scientific narrative plays an axiomatic role in political debates and in policy making, and it's really structured a lot of our social world and society. But also the neuroscientific narrative shapes how we see ourselves and how we internalize what we are, and therefore affects how we interact with each other and inhabit the world. So therefore, developing a more sophisticated understanding then of what we are really doing when we engage with these contemplative practices requires an intelligent response to the growing ascendancy of neuroscientific interpretations of human behavior. So a lot of people that come to these contemplative practices now come to these practices through a scientific framework, and the neuroscience of mindfulness and meditation specifically, which I'll focus on here, but there's also the neuroscience of yoga and Tai Chi, but these are, but I'm going to focus just on the research on meditation. So what happens to these practices in terms of the actual technique and also in terms of the experiences that they engender and the personal or collective transformations that can issue forth from these techniques? What happens to them, to all of that, when we're starting with the framework of science and neuroscience? So meditation is often conceived as a kind of inner meta-awareness, something that happens in your own private mind. And mindfulness is, and then the research on meditation has identified during that process of internalizing your attention and regulating your emotions, what are all the neurological markers that occur from that? And there's a very good sort of summary of some work here that I pulled up, which no one's going to be able to see, but basically this is a good example of the authors have sort of identified different processes in attention regulation. So holding your attention, mind wandering, being aware that you've become distracted, reorientating your awareness, and then sustaining the focus. And they've identified particular brain networks that are associated with each of these internal dynamics of meditation. So that's all very well and very interesting, but what does that do to the way that we understand these practices? What happens is that we result in a very individual conception of someone of a mindful person or of meditation. And this gets superimposed onto these biological substrates. And I'm taking inspiration from Evan Thompson's work here, who borrows from Ian Hacking this idea of looping effects, where we take a category, we invent a category, we take it as real, and then we use those categories, and they so in terms of mindfulness, we make up this category of what mindfulness is or what a mindful person is, and then we give it biological reality, and then we internalize that in our practices. We think that meditation is about our own private self and that it has these biological markers. And there are lots of critiques of this kind of way of conceptualizing meditation. There's, for a long time, the philosopher Slovak Zizek has criticized this sort of fetishizing of what he calls Western Buddhism, but more accurately, we call it Buddhist modernism. How it fits perfectly into a consumerist corporate culture that needs to pacify itself from the endless stress of global capitalism. So this idea that mindfulness is somehow in the head reinforces this selfish individualism, and we can ignore, or we don't need to deal with a larger context and larger social context. And it also makes it a marketable commodity, and so on and so on. But a deeper critique of this kind of neuroscience of meditation and how it affects us is well, since I've got 5 minutes left, instead of, there's different ways that we can conceptualize neurological function that I feel are more conducive to real contemplative insight. So this one-to-one mapping of cognitive function onto neural activity is problematic for many ways, and the way of us understanding contemplative practices somehow being an individual internalization of our private mental theatre is problematic. So these two, there's other ways of using or conceptualizing or understanding what the mind is, what the brain is, and how it all relates to contemplation that I find is more conductive to a contemplative engagement and journey. But before, I want to kind of link it all up with this metaphysics. So I'm going to jump to the underlying, to sort of science as a whole, and how we can actually use these contemplative traditions to serve science in its endeavor to understand the universe and the whole. So currently, science has a blind spot in that it doesn't see. Well, I've actually got a quote from the Upanishads, so it's perhaps not just modern science, but what is unseen is the seen, what is unheard is the hearing. So when we engage in our scientific endeavors, what is unseen is the instruments that we're using, the situation that we're in, our own bodies, and experience itself. So Wittgenstein says conscious experience is not something, but it's not nothing either. So treating conscious experience as an object, a phenomenon to be studied, is problematic. There's also, I'm really enjoying the writings of Nishide Kitaro at the moment, who is a Japanese philosopher who specialized in German idealism and also in Zen Buddhism. And he says, nothing in the visual field allows you to infer that it is seen by the eye. Another quote of his is, as soon as one has adopted the standpoint of objective knowledge, the knower does not exist. I wrote it right down. Exist does not enter into the visual field. So, what is missing from our scientific studies, and especially when we're dealing with our scientific studies on contemplation and on consciousness, is that we lose the standpoint of experience, and we don't see. Science doesn't understand itself, really. And there are ways of coming around this, of recovering subjective experience back into the scientific process. And there are philosophers that have this, I don't know if this is really so much in alignment with Kant's transcendental reduction, maybe that's a question for you actually, or Husserl's Ecology, or contemplative meditation. There are ways of they can serve as ways of bringing back experience and consciousness, not treating it as a problem, but really being aware of it as a departure point for our inquiry. I could go on, so I just did 1 more minute.
Yeah.
To close, I'll just skip to, there are lots of so Francisco Varela, who was a Chilean biologist and neuroscientist and philosopher, and he proposed that there's no theory that is going to be. There's no theory, but rather we need to find a remedy, a stance in which the problem does not even arise, the hard problem of consciousness does no longer arise. In any theoretical approach of consciousness, and I quote him now, what is missing is not the coherent nature of the explanation, but its alienation from human life. Only putting human life back in will erase that absence, not some profound theoretical fix. So, in a sense, if we are really wanting to understand religion and contemplative experience and spirituality with our current scientific language and practice and framework, is going to require a shift in our own being, in our own lived experience, or a shift of the mindset, as my teacher would say. This is what is necessary in order to overcome the hard problem. And contemplative practices then no longer become an object or a problem for science, but a crucial element of a broader solution.
Questions?
You had said, in the introduction, I think it was said that you did your BA or MA work in the field of neurophenomenology.
Neuroscience.
Oh,
But then I got, so my interest now is to I did straight neuroscience, but I was always leaning towards neurophenomenology.
So my question about that is, we recently had there was a big panel of Buddhist scholars, practitioners, neuroscientists, and a woman who introduced to us, I hadn't really known of it, neurophenomenology, French. Her first name is Claire.
Yeah, that's who I.
Have you studied with her?
Yes.
Well, she just did a paper that's got uploaded in academia.edu with you. So my question is, you were just about, or so I hallucinated, say that there's more fruitful ways rather than mapping these discrete things in the brain that are from neuroscience. And I wondered if you were going to invoke anything about neurophenomenology.
Yeah, well, in terms of different ways of conceptualizing the mind and understanding its relationship to the brain, this is more coming from Evan Thompson's work in Core cognition, and I find that framework of not reducing our minds to neural activity, but understanding that it's dependent on our bodies and also embedded within a culture and within a natural environment. And that is more helpful. But in terms of Claire Petit-Morjan and her work, she is developing this technique called microphenomenology, is probably what her paper is about, which is a way of interviewing people in a very fine-grained manner so as to, a 45-minute interview can be really looking at the dynamics of about 3 seconds of someone's experience, and then as a way to be able to bring introspective reports of experience back into the rigor of a scientific practice. So it's a way of actually changing the way that science treats introspective reports, but then also there could be another element where the scientist himself does this kind of analysis on their own process of doing science. And so you get this reflexive treatment of the production of that knowledge. So that is great. That's like a shift in the logic and language and practice and culture of science itself. But what I was talking about here, referring to here, is that to be aware of our own concepts that we're using when we talk about mind and brain, and some are more limiting than others, and some are more conducive than others when we are ourselves engaging in a contemplative discipline. Does that make sense?
Oops. Okay. Ashton.
I want you guys to, if you haven't already opened up your imaginations, open them. So I'm gonna tell you some stories and play. And I have a disclaimer as I begin. So the we I speak with is an invitational one. If you feel as though my remarks don't apply to you, then they don't. So my intention is not to swallow you up. So why bother with metaphysics? Before I answer, let me first situate myself. I write to you now from the Robert Hines Reading Room at University of California, Berkeley. If I look up from where I type, I see a gilded ceiling. A long expanse of bronze ornament stretches out, deepening my thoughts. Roving my head around, I see a series of name tags emblazoned at the meeting place between wall and roof. There. The first I compute is Descartes. Then there's Kant across the way, Voltaire and Goethe, among other giants of the Western story. Why bother with metaphysics? Things just are the way they are. All the work has been done, just look up. The name tags, as large as I am, say it all. So let's be gracious to our forebears. Their discoveries, some more than others, have built the foundation of the house through which we window gaze upon the world. I, for one, am not an undutiful son. Thank you, dear forebears. So why metaphysics? Well, what if things could be otherwise? True, I do feel a bit drafty. I know that I can ignore the cracks, but I can't much longer. So yes, the word discoveries I used earlier was sort of triggering. Decision sounds a bit more apt. What if things could be otherwise? It compels me to admit something. I've lied to you all. I'm not actually writing this from Robert Hines' reading room. I'm actually in the historic North reading room across the hall. On my way to the bathroom, I passed Robert's room and was spellbound by its ceiling, more elaborate than in the North. Then I noticed Descartes' name tag and a light bulb went on. A way to begin this talk. But I didn't want to sit in Robert's room. The light wasn't bright enough, the sun wasn't coming in. So no need, I thought to myself. They'll never know the difference. And then another light bulb went off. Why bother with metaphysics? Well, what if things could be otherwise? So far I've got two. I'm either writing to you from Robert Hines' reading room or I'm writing to you from North's reading room. Which one is more real? Does it matter? I think it does, and I promise you the latter is the real one, though you won't ever know for sure. So just go with it for now. Two stories so far, stirring two different sets of associations, shaping and reshaping each individual future of you who listen. Perhaps, even for those of you who are tuning me out, if any of you are, the vibrations of my voice still acting upon your eardrums. Maybe the futural differences are negligible, but who really knows? What does this have to do with metaphysics, though? In a very simple way, the differences matter because the difference could mean a different future, a different story. So far, my storytelling has been concerned with choice and behavior at the level of conscious awareness, though no doubt stories always reach deeper. The deeper we go, the thicker the entrenchment of story. What we know before we know. the overarching narrative stubbornly looping on and on. It is at this level, the deep unconscious, keeper of cosmologies, that story derives its force, the root bed of Whitewater. I am possessed by certain assumptions about myself and the world. I am a subject set against the world as object. I am a princess locked forever in a tower. I am lonely. And my loneliness leads me to question the story. I rebel against my forebears. Yet eventually I realize that only because of them have I been led to ask such questions. Thank you, dear forebears. Perhaps there's no bridging Kant's transcendental divide, that gap between my experience and things in themselves. Perhaps we are bound to Quentin Mayhew's correlationism, the life sentence of only being able to speculate from unique perspectives. But maybe, following Timothy Morton, we ought to consider how unique to human beings that gap truly is. Have we rushed to copyright something that is and always was part of the commons? Or are we porous, pervious, perforated bags of water like Morton has it? It has been 381 years since Descartes published his Discourse on Method. Though it pre-existed US copyright laws, I imagine the gap has long since entered the public domain. So can we ease up on our skepticism about experience and the experience of other beings? Meanwhile, our world is heating up, unraveling and revealing the taken for granted connections of our stable Holocene, that quaint period of periodicity reified into cyclical cosmology and calendar coming to an end. In comes the Anthropocene, a concept which signals the time whereof the thumbprint of human activity stamps itself boldly across and deeply into the planet. We have become a geologic force, yet paradoxically, the Anthropocene, Timothy Morton tells us, is at the same time one of the first truly anti-anthropocentric concepts, because via thinking the Anthropocene, we get to see the concept of species as it really is. Species is a subscendent hyperobject, brittle and inconsistent. The Anthropocene is the moment at which species becomes thinkable in a non-metaphysical way, such that humankind cannot rigidly exclude non-humans. The human becomes smaller than the sum of its parts. Human, bacterial microbiome, prosthetic parts. Humankind is, as I said before, intrinsically disabled without hope of a healthy, explosive holism. Subscendence is Morton's favorite form of holism, what he calls implosive holism. In contrast to explosive holism, the perspective which hoists the transcendent whole over the less than parts, implosive holism has it the other way around. The parts are many and they make up the fragile whole. Both are equally real, but the latter is wholly dependent upon its parts or partial connections for existence. Morton is in league with other thinkers like Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour, who claim that taking the ecological crisis seriously means challenging metaphysical assumptions. Assumptions like explosive holism, which undercut the significant role connections play in constituting the whole. James Lovelock's Gaia theory is often misattributed this kind of scheme, wherein Gaia is thought to be a soul-like, self-organizing system maintaining planetary disequilibrium, our benevolent Earth Mother keeping house. As Latour explains, a closer reading of Lovelock reveals that what Gaia refers to is only, I'm going to look more at you guys, is only the name proposed for all the intermingled and unpredictable consequences of the agents, all of us, and all the other creatures, each of which is pursuing its own interests by manipulating its own environment. Morton won't even touch the term Gaia, and instead refers to the relying on of the biosphere as the symbiotic real, in which entities are related in what he says in a total non-ragged way, a non-total ragged way. Nothing is connected to everything. Everything is connected to something, Donna Haraway tells us. She'll call this, among other names, ongoingness, that tangling mess of symbiosis, or becoming with, that makes up Earth systems. Each of these tricksters defies the ontic separation between mind and world because the ecological crisis makes it a political matter. Together, they wait on the other side of the gap, taunting us to make the leap. And with their own neologisms, each trickster urges us to consciously practice relinking with our creaturely fellows. Each of us, partial connections participating in constituting the biosphere. For Haraway, it is about cultivating responsibility. Morton calls it attunement. And Latour wants us reflexively looping and relooping forever, treating the whole we seek as Sisyphus does his boulder. We are to aestheticize ourselves, to realize a cosmopoetics of ecological belonging. The story of a transcendent whole taken for granted is stale and outworn. Metaphysical systems tell stories and vice versa. Because of this, Haraway admonishes us to realize that it matters which stories tell stories as a practice of caring and thinking. Given that human life and the capacity to spin stories derives in the first place from ecological being, it's not a far stretch to say that though we can tell many, some stories are better told than others. Some hit closer to home. The problem of transcendence is one of the reasons metaphysics has been rejected. Like my disclaimer at the beginning suggested, employing wholes like the term we has historically swallowed important differences, sacrificed to the totalizing project of what William Desmond calls determinative curiosity. Determinative curiosity, though, is an orphan, lost and very insecure. Imagine a lost child on the street. It has forgotten its home and throws tantrums for absolute certainty. It believes that to be is to be intelligible. So anything that is, I can certainly know what it is. But curiosity is not born in a vacuum, Desmond has it. Rather, in a totally opposite manner, curiosity first derives from what Desmond calls original astonishment. Its home is in wonder, and to wonder it will always return. So Desmond creates this scheme. He delineates the process of knowing as first beginning in astonishment. So we're like, whoa, it's that experience of, whoa, what is this? And then it leads to perplexity. There's something about this excess that overwhelms me and surprises me that is sort of bothersome. What could this indefiniteness mean? And then we go to curiosity. So that's like the movement to seek to understand or to know it. And he thinks it's important to distinguish these because in the main we have tended to think, he says, of the process of mindfulness, whether philosophical or scientific, in terms of the third possibility, so just in terms of curiosity, reducing astonishment and perplexity to mere hurdles in the process of determining certainty or truth. Brought home to itself, curiosity, what we might also call reason, realizes that not everything may be intelligible. I can't determine everything. I can't put everything into a box. This is important for our metaphysical struggle to think the whole. Implosive holism may be a helpful critique for providential laziness, but if we keep living business as usual, as if Gaia or Mother Nature will clean up our mess. But I think there is something about the call of our tricksters to resensitize ourselves to what we might still call nature, or Gaia, or the symbiotic real, or ongoingness, that still whispers of a more majestic whole, a kind of holy whole. Morton is not down with transcendence, but his neologism, hyperobject, an entity massively distributed in space and time, like the symbiotic real, or nature, or like global warming, it's something you can't point to. It's just like vast, it's excess, it like inspires astonishment. Is something we might call transcendent if we rethink how transcendence is conventionally understood. What if we thought transcendence, as Jake puts it, as the superlative form of immanence? Transcendence, understood this way, is something we actually experience, what generates our experience of astonishment. Desmond links it with the hyperbolic or over-determinate nature of being itself. So it's like that excess of just isness, the sheer excess that catches us up in wonder. Awe then becomes a way back to a whole, a route for us to tread as we resensitize ourselves to our ecological becoming with other creatures. Rooted back, curiosity realizes that not everything can be circumscribed by concepts. The whole, Raymond Panikar tells us, is not the sum total of substantial selves, is not an object, and thus is impervious to any episteme that aims at objective knowledge. Furthermore, it is not the proper field of any exclusive ontology, that is, of any approach to being exclusively by means of logos or reason or determinative curiosity. Well, actually, I shouldn't conflate those two. They're different. Our attempt requires also the pneuma, the spirit, love, not as a second fiddle playing to the echoes of reason, but as loving knowledge. The call to aestheticize ourselves, to our involvement with the partial connections that make up our biosphere, is a call to remember the whole in a more playful way. It is a call back to metaphysics, revived and fleshy. The language we use to tell the stories matters, and some words won't do. The language totalizing concepts of the whole must give way to more playful symbolic expressions, images that approach the whole, yet are humbly understood as our best sketches of the inexpressible. Cosmopoetics can then be understood as the effort to take philosophical language playfully serious, an effort to create aesthetic rituals of thought resonant enough with the real to make doing metaphysics tantamount to passing through a conceptual birth canal, to re-sensitize ourselves. Why bother with metaphysics? Because some stories are better told than others. The princess agrees. Let me out of this tower. Sorry, it was not as improvisational as it could have been, or human. One day.
Just right.
Thanks.
Questions for Ashton?
Just, can you repeat what Jake says about transcendence?
Transcendence, why don't you say it? I didn't misquote you, did
No,
I?
that was perfect.
Can you say it one more time, please?
I often say that transcendence is the superlative mode.
Oh,
Mode.
I did
Or
misquote
form.
you.
Or form.
Form
I
or
switch
mode.
between
Okay.
form or
Thank
mode.
you.
Ashton, thank you for that. Was I right in detecting alongside your love and appreciation for the two tricksters, the three, a kind of friendly impatience with what might be construed as a self-indulgent shirking of an ethical responsibility to engage the whole and honor the whole, whatever the whole may be?
Well, I think what I realized was that there, and maybe I'm incorrect, but in encountering this idea of determinative curiosity and how the whole process of knowing has been conflated with that, it made me think that maybe these thinkers who are working with implosive holism are working with that because of this critique of explosive holism and the way determinative curiosity is bound up with trying to conceptualize the whole in a certain kind of way, in a totalizing, systematizing kind of way. And so in a roundabout way, by each of them in their own unique ways, saying that we need to resensitize ourselves to the symbiotic real, or to ongoingness, or to Gaia, that they're talking about a whole, but in a more agnostic way, but they're still talking about it, and they want us to sensitize ourselves to it. And so I just kind of, I imagine it as a roundabout way of affirming the whole, but not taking it for granted. So it's like, I may not be answering your question. It's like they're asking us to be spiritual and not saying it exactly. But I also understand why they wouldn't say it exactly, because the way spiritual has been understood isn't what they want to express, conventionally understood. I'm not sure if that was articulate. We can stop there so Jake can talk.
Does anybody have another question for Ashton? So how are you guys feeling? We could jump straight into Jake's responses, or we could take a short 5-minute break, resettle. How are you feeling?
Does anybody need to be?
We're a little crammed in back here. So
I'm taking a break. but
okay,
you guys
let's
don't have
take,
to.
we'll take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and hear from Jake.
Great job.
Patient with notions on her way and working sometimes and Latour.
He said,
Very contemporary. Can't you see more?
Are we ready? I think we're ready.
Okay, sure. I think so. First I just want to start by saying thanks to the three panelists for such fantastic and really rich reflections and presentations. It's, on a personal note, it's just a complete joy for me to get to sit up here and listen to people who I've been privileged to share a class with for the last semester, and to hear them present so much of the material that we've been thinking on, that we've been thinking about long before you showed up in the class. To hear it here is just really moving. So y'all are awesome. Deeply appreciate you. What I'm going to try to do in my reflections, and I'll keep it short so that we can get to a bigger discussion. I want to pull out one thing that I heard from each of you and try to weave it into a little bit of a coherent narrative that I thought I heard maybe through your three presentations. And then I'm going to try to give it a little bit of context to maybe bring a broader reflection on what all that might mean for how we think about metaphysics and its fate today. And then maybe open it up to further discussion after that. So to begin with, when William was talking, I felt like so much of what I heard you saying, William, was about the almost perennial discussion about the relationship of science and religion, really. And metaphysics, of course, comes in there, because if science and religion are to have anything other than just an antagonistic relationship, or a relationship of one consuming the other, then almost certainly you need some form of metaphysics as the mediating discourse between the two. And I thought you were building to that conclusion, if I heard you rightly, throughout your reflections, and really raising a number of powerful questions along the way. One that I'm not certain about where I stand on was when you ended thinking about science as well. Let me try to put it as accurate as I can, or at least as I can remember what you said. Science is kind of dealing with the empirical external world, and religion as ideally dealing with the internal world, the world of reflection. Although you also talked about the way that science can then become metaphysics, as it were. And I think maybe, so I'll just throw this out there as a question for you. You talked about the way that science can become metaphysics when it moves beyond its own sphere or beyond its competency. And I wondered whether that was, you could think about that either as legitimate or illegitimate, right? Because there could be an illegitimate extension of science beyond its own sphere of epistemic competency, and it just starts making pronouncements about what has to be the case, or about modal claims about necessity and contingency, and world claims of a sort of universal scope, and that might be illegitimate. But what about legitimate extensions of can the deliverances of science legitimately prompt us to metaphysical reflection and discovery in new ways? And how do we determine or distinguish between when we're legitimately moving beyond and when we're illegitimately moving beyond the claims of science? Because it can't just be that, like, it's legitimate when the philosopher does it, but illegitimate when the scientist does it. So I think sometimes Einstein made this claim at one point. He says, in times of, because he had a lot of friends who were philosophers of science, and he said there's a lot that the physicist can learn from the philosopher of science, but that sometimes, especially in times of real discovery, the scientist knows better than the philosopher where the shoe pinches, is how he put it. And so you get this, because the scientist is wearing the shoe, the scientist is in the middle of it, so he knows where the metaphysical issues are sticking, where something needs to give. And so there may be a necessary metaphysical component to the development of science in non-ordinary times of scientific advancement. I'm curious about that. then he brought in these really interesting reflections on Kant at the end, and which I think started to open up into some of the area that Millie really focused us on, which is the role of the first person perspective in the questions of the relationship, the ongoing importance and relationship of metaphysics, its relationship to science, and the relationship of science and religion again, right? And so what I heard a lot of your work building towards, Millie, was the notion that there could be not a science of the first person perspective in the objective genitive, so not a science about first person experience, but a science of the first person perspective in the subjective genitive. That is, a science that incorporates the first person perspective, especially a kind of refinement, a skillful first person perspective. Might be called mindfulness, might be called contemplative activity. And can that actually, and what I found really intriguing in what you were building towards, and I wasn't certain what your answer was, or whether you were giving us an answer yet, was the notion of, like, what can that accomplish? What could be accomplished if we had a practice of intellectual inquiry that was rule governed the way that our scientific practices are, but that also included the first person perspective as part of that rule governed inquiry, right? And that's intriguing to me, and I'm curious what you would say to that. I'm curious what the rest of us might think about that. So at this point, we've got kind of science and religion introduced and their relationship. We have the inclusion of the first person perspective. And then Ashton Ashton came in to introduce the notion of story in relationship to all of this. And if you were pointing us, Millie, towards the inclusion of first person perspectives, especially skillful ones, right? Some contemplative traditions that involve training. And the reason why that seems important to me is because both of those have a certain not just deliberation, but a certain discipline to them, which is what I'm getting at by this notion of rule-governed inquiry and rule-governed formation. Ashton opened up the space of play within metaphysical, what do we call it? Speculation within metaphysical adventures, looking at the space of play and its relationship to originary astonishment, and maybe the space of play in its relationship to the return to astonishment after one's made one's way through perplexity and determinate curiosity, and so forth. And for you, Ashton, I heard the realm of story becoming especially important, which introduced another alternative mode of thinking, right? If each of you were raising the possibility of different modes of thinking, giving us a different relationship to metaphysics, I heard Ashton really raising the question of, does story, does play, does maybe even gesture or performance, does this bring in a different mode of engaging with metaphysical questions that's not subcognitive? That's the other bit that I thought was really interesting in some of the claims you were making, Ashton, is it wasn't that we need to sort of quit all this ratiocination and get below that, before things were ruined by speculative ratiocination. Instead, it was you move through these intellectual forms of inquiry, and then you discover that maybe there are parts of the world, not just maybe, in my very determinate inquiries into the world, trying to think as clearly, as logically as I can about the world, I come up against things that are in themselves resistant to that form of logical inquiry. It's not that I don't have the mind capable of it, right? So that if I merged with the board or something, I'd be able to think it all. But in fact, that there are things that in their being, that ontologically, they resist capture by a kind of algebra of concepts, and instead invite a different mode of narration that might be story or some other form of expression. I think that's really fascinating. And all of those struck me when I was listening to you, and I know this is really reflective of where I tend to think, but it struck me that even though the course that we've all been in together and the texts we've been reading together start with Hume and Kant and move their way upward, in fact, lots of these questions, the relationship of science and religion, the first-person perspective, the role of myth and story, lots of them go back to a conflict or a difference between the Platonic and the Aristotelian traditions. And I think that might be another useful way for us to think about our relationship to metaphysics today. So Plato thought, when you do metaphysics, or which he didn't have the name for metaphysics, but he thought that when you do deep philosophical inquiry, when you try to speculate about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the things that he cared most to speculate about, he seemed to think, because he performed it this way for us, that you inevitably end up at a place where the inquiry gives way to a story, to a myth, right? And so for Plato, it involves the aspects that Millie was talking about. It involves the questions of the relationship of science and religion that you were talking about. When Socrates narrates sort of his own discovery of philosophy, Socrates talks about how at first he's out there looking at, he's learning from all the philosophers that are around him. He's learning from the people that we now call pre-Socratics, and especially the ones that we call the naturalists, right? So he's learning to think about maybe the real is just, maybe it's just made out of water, or maybe it's just made out of air, or maybe it's just out of fire. And he's testing all these things. And then he comes to realize that there has to be something more. And the thing he realizes there has to be more of is mind. There has to be, which, we would say consciousness. There has to be some kind of subjective element in it, that just looking to describe things in terms of externality wasn't enough for him. And so then he enters on what he calls his second journey, which is a naval metaphor for when ships leaving, ships leaving into the Mediterranean. The first journey is you always start. You send your ship out as long as you can when there's wind at your back, right? So that you can put up your sails and fly away. But inevitably, your wind gives out before you get where you're going. And that's when the second journey starts, which is when you have to put the oars in the water, do work. And so by the second journey, Socrates meant this difficult ability to turn the mind in reflection upon its own processes. So to bring the mind, to bring to reflective awareness the activity of the mind itself in the elicitation or the performance of the worlds we dwell in. So he's thinking about the relationship of science and religion. He's thinking about subjectivity. And whenever he follows these inquiries through to the end, all of the Platonic dialogues tend to do one of two things. They either end in aporia, which is a fancy Greek word of saying where there's no way forward. You just sort of end where are we? We're just stuck in a muddle. But that's a really useful thing. That's a learned ignorance rather than just ignorance, because you've made your way through what you thought you knew and discovered, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't really know what I thought I knew about this thing before. I thought I knew what piety was, or nature, or science, or whatever, or metaphysics. Maybe today we ended in aporia, and we thought we knew what metaphysics was before we got together, and now we don't. But that can be an advance. But the other way he ends, Plato ends many of the dialogues, is not in aporia, but in a myth. And so he retells a story. Could be the myth of Ur, or it could be a myth about the afterlife, or it could be a myth about, how does it end in the Phaedrus, the wonderful myth of Thoth that he's borrowed from the Egyptians. And I think this is really intentional on his part. This is a way of speaking about the ascent, something that's simultaneously a conceptual, mystical, or spiritual ascent. It's using the mind, it's using dialectic, it's using reasoning, and instead of using the mind and dialectic and reasoning to demythologize, actually only through the process of thinking in that disciplined and rigorous way, does he then find the only way forward now is to tell a story, so that we find that the character of reality is maybe not amenable to exact description, but permits expression in narrative or art or something like that. And that expression might have a critical advantage over exact description, might even have a advantage in terms of precision over exact description, because the world is the world in its fullness, in its becoming, and its replete ambiguity. Maybe that's not the right word. The word Desmond uses is overdetermination, which I kind of like. The word the Gnostics use is pleroma, which I like maybe even more. But it's pleromatic fullness, a fullness that's in no way determined the way everything we encounter is determined, right? We're all determined by a difference from one another and the specific relationships we have to each other. Omni definitio est negatio, the scholastics like to say. Every definition is a negation, right? We draw boundaries over. But something that's fuller than our drawing of determinate boundaries isn't less than cognitive, isn't less than determinate. It's not indeterminate. It's more than determinate. And if there is reality like that, then to speak about it, which is to do metaphysics in one sense, would mean needing not to just do metaphysics in the mode that we did for 1700 years or more, which is metaphysics that seem to rest on dialectic, and that seem to rest on ratiocination, deductive proofs or something like that, to incorporate a kind of poetic metaphysics into our practice of inquiry. And that seemed to me to be where I was hearing so much of your papers, the congruence of your papers as they flowed into each other. Those were the kind of reflections that brought up in me. So thank you for opening our discussion and leading it forward in such a wonderful way. I deeply appreciate all of you. Yeah, please.
So I think, I mean, I didn't quite get, as you were saying, where would this lead if we were able to change the sort of metaphysical roots of science and inspired by contemplation perhaps, or whatever our contemporary religion is and how it's manifesting. I think partly what it does lead to is more of understanding the partiality of any understanding, and that it's no longer even desirable to know everything or find, as you were saying, a theory of everything. Like science is always trying to find a theory of everything, but that seems like such it's like, then awe and astonishment and wonder are such an integral part of what it means to be and to be human. And so yeah, I can see this is how it's all linking up for me as well, that it kind of does lead to this regaining our capacity to be surprised and to have wonder, and it's more of a, can be described as a poetic way of understanding cosmology than the sort of very sterile and dead way of objectifying the life world or even spirit or whatever, which is the aim of science. Okay. We did it in the we did speak in the right order.
That's very cool.
How I see this.
I wanted to respond to your query, and I think I mean in my huge broad brushes, I think I'm constantly hearing myself and needing to completely revise a little bit. But in terms of science and if science doing metaphysics is beyond its purview, so science as complete ideality, which it doesn't exist ideally. Nothing exists like just with their, the pole. It really is just within a certain purview and a certain prediction and et cetera. Like, and the equations are going to give you this specific output, and so you can predict this and that. But as soon as we're giving meaning to any of it, almost immediately you are kind of doing metaphysics, and not that it's illegitimate. It's the main qualm that I have is that somehow metaphysics has become, at least in some scientific views, kind of a bad word. If you're doing metaphysics, you're not being a scientist.
Right.
But that's just, I don't see that being true. If you're giving meaning to any of your our knowledge about the universe, like you have to, in some sense, be doing metaphysics. I mean, even just the fact that there is meaning is a metaphysical phenomenon. And so I think really what I want to see is I want to see the popular science writers admit that what they're doing is metaphysics, and admit that in order to make any sense and fuller meaning and big picture of the things that we find in scientific inquiry, we're getting into a metaphysical realm. And when I was speaking of science versus religion versus philosophy, and again, I want to clarify that I don't mean to pigeonhole religion into just a study of the inner nature, but nor do I want to pigeonhole science into a purely pragmatic endeavor, because again, it's always this, it's a matter of having distinct poles that are nonetheless, existentially the same. Like that was from Panikar, I think, was mentioning that in terms of his idea of the Trinity, is that it's about understanding, having separate, distinct concepts that, like in Bergson talks about differences in degree and differences in kind, and he sees it, in a way, he has like an idea of reality as duality, but only as, again, like a heuristic, in order to understand that everything is an admixture of it all. And so I think it's like I want to see scientists take ethical and responsibility for both where the inquiries are headed, and also metaphysical responsibility in terms of what they're putting forth, and allowing themselves to be in conversation with philosophers and metaphysicians or what have you. Because yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that by pigeonholing them, it's really to the detriment of both, and that's maybe an easily oft repeated statement, but I believe it's very true. Yeah.
I'm not sure that when scientists are doing science, they're necessarily doing metaphysics. I think they're doing science. There's just but it's based upon philosophical. It's based upon scientific naturalism, which is a philosophical thesis and doesn't belong to the actual practice of science. In order to do science, you have to assume that everything that is real is physical. But then, if you start asking what's physical, then you get into metaphysics.
Yes.
But then,
Yeah.
actually, the actual practice of science as a methodology, I'm not sure.
I would completely
I would
agree.
make a distinction.
I would completely agree. Thank you for making that decision. The practice as separate from the interpretation.
Yeah.
And so essentially it's like, yeah, the practice is an ideal practice of science, and it's never done in a vacuum. And so there's always our emotions and our kind of our myth, I guess, that we place it into. But so I guess it's when we are involved in making meaning out of the results, that's when we begin to just slowly enter into metaphysics. I'm not saying that science as a practice is metaphysical, but when we, especially in the popular realm, when people write books about what we've discovered, they're placing all of our experiments and our data and our interpretations, they're placing them into a context that has meaning, and that is kind of
And I
the
think that
circle.
also ties into what Ashton was saying about the importance of story and concepts and becoming self-aware, or for science to become more self-aware of the effects of the concepts that they're using and the stories that they're telling. So how does it how is it internalized within? How is it sort of imbued within all of our social systems, and how is it internalized in ourselves, and how does that affect the way that we experience the world and inhabit the world, and so just like a more of almost like it's like being more responsible for the stories that are being created from the scientific community, right? But they've been responsible or aware of the effects that those stories are having. And part of being a contemplative in today's world and modern society requires an awareness of what those narratives and stories are doing to our own mind and consciousness and being and all of these things.
Is there, could you see any sort of conceptual assumptions being in the methodology of science itself? Or does that make sense?
Conceptual assumptions.
Apart from like what is brought to it by the kind of socio-historical placing, but so then just in the practice of science itself, there's a kind of metaphysics present, apart from what then is added up, like you could assume physicalism, or you could assume some sort of other cosmology, but I just can't expound the principles of science in my head, so I'm just asking myself whether or not that methodology has any metaphysical assumptions itself.
Well, I mean, the big move in modern science, the Galilean move that determines what is going to count as science, is the inversion of what had been and what still is arguably the lived quality of our experience. So Galileo says that the real qualities of our experience, the fact, like wetness and warmth and so on, and color, and let alone love and compassion and so on, that these are secondary qualities, and that science, legitimate science, is only concerned with so-called primary qualities, which are those that are only amenable through abstraction out of experience, quantification, and formalization into algebra, right? So if that isn't a metaphysical assumption, so if that's true, there is no scientific method without a prior metaphysical inversion. So that's the myth or the story that science is living within. That's unformatted. It's the blind spot that you're talking about.
I think Herschel spoke of Galileo as both a revealer and a concealer. So he was a revealer in revealing the mathematical structures of, or the mathematical ideality, I can't remember his terminology, of the universe, but then concealing the life of lived experience by superimposing that onto it. That was,
It seems to me that it's possible in principle to have a science that doesn't divide the world into primary and secondary qualities. But I can't imagine a science that doesn't presuppose some degree of uniformity in nature. So that would seem to be a little bit closer to a kind of analytic, metaphysical presupposition that science needs in order to proceed. But I don't think that you have to necessarily do that. I'm not sure.
But that is how
That
is
is how, in
science.
fact, it occurred. But if we're asking about it in a more analytical way, I don't see how science could hang together without presupposing a basic uniformity in nature, such that inference has any possibility of purchase upon extra scientific reality.
Good philosophers of science will oftentimes point out the extent to which there are metaphysics presupposed and it's not just the uniformity
Sure.
Tim Maudlin writes an interesting book called The Metaphysics of Physics. That's a really rich book about the sort of the metaphysical machinery necessary in order to do theoretical physics, in order to proceed along it. And Heidegger makes that point in Being in Time right at the outset, saying there's all these specialized, what he calls ontical forms of inquiry that aren't ontological, and they're ontical because they're investigating particular things, and they're relying on all these concepts that are impossible to determine within the science itself, which was, frankly, a Thomist and Aristotelian point way before Heidegger came up with it. Sure. Am I calling on people, or how are we doing this?
I guess
I see Stephen there. So
well, we kind of moved into general discussion, which is good. But if any of the panelists want to say any last words in response to each other, or just have a final thought, then we can kind of continue with the larger questions.
I wanted to add something just to this conversation as it was going. I think the problem is, I mean, science for science to work at all, to be practical, you have to be studying or inquiring or experimenting on things that are repeatable, or things that you can show work and will work again in the future given the same circumstances. So like in order to do, so that really limits you though in terms of what you can look at. And so the insincere move, insincere metaphysical move is to say, because there are things in the world, there are aspects of reality that are amenable to perfect repetition and experiment like this, that must be primary. And maybe this is a result of this, like the Platonic dream of pure order and mathematics and, et cetera, is that because it worked, it was such an astonishment maybe that was assumed, maybe not assumed, but that was then placed at the highest pedestal as like the main principle of everything else. And the problem with that is, as you were mentioning, you're taking the human out of that. You're negating the fact that in order to discover that, you required agency and creativity and all of these things that have nothing to do with the repeatability of a ball rolling down an inclining plane. And so the major I think irresponsible or even just insincere metaphysical flip is to place the perfect knowledge of the smallest things as the most important ontological basis for the universe. And it's such a, I mean, we kind of take it for granted that, oh yes, but science works. Yeah, but on what? You can't, human being is not repeatable in the same way. Once you move to greater levels of complexity, you can no longer abstract in the necessary way to have a repeatable, practical science. And so you're necessarily limited to those aspects of reality that are less interesting and that are more deterministic. And only by totally abstracting yourself out of it and abstracting the whole array of different levels of complexity that do not just add up from the bottom, can you have this whole edifice of deterministic science. And even mathematics, just as the last throw out there, even mathematics with Gödel's incompleteness theorem and and the failed project of Russell and Whitehead of constructing math, you can't even construct mathematics from the bottom up. So the idea that you can construct the universe from the bottom up is just absurd at that point. Anyway, I'm going to, sorry, that was a little bit of excited Bill.
Hold on, let's go back to hands and questions. And, a little bit of, I can sense the temperature rising.
It's the lack
Steven.
of your illusion.
It's an illusion.
Lack of your, so presuppositions, maybe it's metaphysical, although I think the use of the term metaphysical here today was overdetermined. And I would say a way to not domesticate the lovely feral notion of that term would be to remind ourselves that there's something that barely got mentioned by anybody today, which is philosophers of science. Now you could say, yeah, whatever they do, that's part of metaphysics. but it's pose a question maybe for a further panel. In what sense, and it would be really great if actual names were mentioned more who you were invoking, unless of course we're singing our own song. In what sense is philosophy of science, in what senses can it be construed as not metaphysics, or at least to have that discussion? That's part one. Part two is, you know, we could all reread Kuhn's Structure of the Scientific Revolution and remember what a paradigm is, which is basically, to a large extent, if it's not within the paradigmatic majority, the paper won't be published until they're finding more stuff and have to change the paradigm. You can call that a presupposition, but I don't think it's sufficiently nuanced. And my last question is pleroma. In what sense can one imagine that the use of the term whole is a distortion of what was meant by pleroma? Maybe that's fair. Anyway, that's it.
In many senses, yeah, sure. I love everything you just raised, Stephen. And, we'd love to have a longer discussion in this community about philosophy of science. And I tend to think philosophy of science over the last half century has embraced metaphysics, in part because the nature of what people understand by metaphysics is a shifting term. So after anyway, I mean, to mention names, after Quine's critique of after Quine's critique of the two dogmas of empiricism, the idea that one can only responsibly postulate things that are either empirically or tautologously verifiable goes out the window. So then for Quine helps recuperate a sense of metaphysics within philosophy of science as those things that can't be paraphrased away in the best description of what our best practices of science entail, we can claim are metaphysical truths, right? So if there are things that you can't get by, if there are concepts you can't get by without when doing science, like maybe causality or something, although Quine thought causality wasn't one of them. But if there are concepts you can't get by without doing science, then we can talk about those as metaphysics. But that's like a really sort of flatlandy approach to metaphysics too, right? Because that's not talking about the whole or the divine, or for that matter, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And that's where I think, you know, for my part, I'd want to say, I actually think you can't get by doing a lot of our ordinary practices, whether science or relationship or stupid little practices like contractual exchanges of money for apples. I don't think you can get through those without having some implied reference to things like the good, the true, and the beautiful. So I think you can kind of take Quine's method and or portions of Quine's method, the way others have, and build a philosophy of science out of them that does get you to something more replete than just procedural, metaphysical naturalism.
This is a question for Emily. I'm curious about how you might describe or perceive religion when it's not attached to maybe the ways that we've misconstrued it, and what makes us want to move away from it, but if there's an essence to religion.
Well, the way that I've tried to, because I sort of tried to preface at the beginning is my own, I can only speak of my own understanding and experience of religion, and then my own dissatisfaction with my culture telling me what is meaningful and worthwhile pursuits and stuff like this, and so my own search for what could maybe be called spiritual or secular contemplation. And I think religion, what I've come to sort of appreciate about what religion has in the past, or still does in other different cultures than the one I'm in. How it functions is it provides a space of shared meaning and purpose and ethical orientation, and provides a framework within which we can ask and grapple with the great questions of life, such as life and death and sickness and suffering and dying, and all of these things that I've only found those kinds of conversations through finding for me, a yoga practice and a community that so the sort of a lot of the therapeutic effects that might be happening in my brain from me engaging with this community and doing this daily ritualistic practice might not really just be from the actual technique as we're approaching it from the neuroscience. It might be because of this community that I'm a part of, that with whom I can share and understanding an ethical orientation and a place within which to situate myself in the larger cosmos, and all of these things that I was not finding from my upbringing in England, who with a very scientific framework of family and all of these things. Does that make sense? So I think actually what I've come to understand is kind of what I am. What is the difference then between what I am doing as a modern, or as a contemporary practitioner? How is that really differing from the function of religion previously? It's just that the way that we've kind of come to understand religion is perhaps modern Protestant European construct that is part of the proclivities and inherited tendencies that I'm also working with in my own contemplative practice. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
I have a related question. You mentioned Evan Thompson and Ian Hacking and this idea of looping effects, and that it's only after a certain moment or within a certain construct that we view contemplative or meditative practice as something an individual does and something that involves something called introspection. But I'm wondering how strong are those looping effects, do you think? And my question really is, for a person who has passed through that construct, is it possible that they have become that kind of person, and for them it is a practice of an individual doing something called introspection? Or is the looping effect kind of more superficial, and it's only something that we assume to be the case, but then when maybe you look at it with your scientific tools and methods, you see, no, this is actually the same action that people have been engaging in throughout history, they just have a different way of talking about it now? Or are these individuals, have they become subjected, to use that language, have they become isolated individuals? And so for them, it's actually a true characterization of what's happening for them.
Can I try and rephrase to see if I understand correctly? Is the question, what is the question?
About looping effects.
Yeah.
How strong, the sort of the conceptual narrative that we kind of wrap around things, how strong is that? How much does it actually change what's happening in the practice?
I think enormously. I think that the concepts that we use and the frameworks that we use, essentially what is the role of theory in our practice? And it's important in the sense that different concepts will generate different experiences and illuminate different parts of one's experiences. So the theoretical framework within which practice is an element within the practice, and that's also why the particular looping effects that occur in the moment in the narrative of the neuroscience, of contemplative neuroscience, is instantiating a particular individualistic, verified sense of self, which blinds one to the larger social issues that surround us. And there are more, we can't get rid of loop effects, and in fact they're an important part of the practice. It's just that there are some that are more conductive and conducive to and it's also not only the concepts that one is holding, but it's also how one is holding those concepts and that the theory that they're using. And then yeah, I think I'm not sure we would want to get rid of looping effects. It's just rather this refining the use of them and being more aware of them, tracking them.
Sort of like orchestrating grouping effects on purpose.
Yeah.
Which I think is, that's in one sense what ritual does.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It deliberately
Yeah.
dramatizes or stages.
I didn't want to sound like we should get rid of them. I'm just wondering how much weight to do that.
So you were about to say more conducive to, so I was just curious about what you were going to say.
To
Looping effects that are more conducive to, or concepts.
to essentially, if I'm brave enough to say, really go for it. Touching the divine, and I mean, it's hard. It's hard. We're now getting into the space of trying to speak about the unspeakable. That space that essentially is what is driving any of this inquiry in the first place.
Matt had a question?
It's more of an invitation to continue a certain kind of inquiry than a question, but maybe a question will
He's
emerge.
about to talk for a long time.
Well, I'm just trying to get at different meanings of this term metaphysics in a way that maybe it's been a bit loosely deployed. And so there's like the Barnes and Noble definition of metaphysics, right, where you have the bookshelf with the tarot card and astrology books and stuff, which is a view of metaphysics as something more that can't be explained by our normal scientific view of the world. There's something else that's more mysterious, in excess of the world that science describes. And then there's other senses of metaphysics where, say, usually Kant's transcendental method is not described as metaphysics, but as anti-metaphysical. But in another way, I think Kant himself says he's trying to inaugurate a new form of metaphysics that would be scientific, where through reason and experience, reflection upon experience, we can discover the structures that precondition our experience. And so instead of metaphysics being something extra, it's rather a search for the conditions that make possible our scientific knowledge of nature. And then there's another sense of metaphysics, which is coming more from someone like Whitehead, where given our scientific knowledge that comes from all these special sciences that speak their own languages and deal in their own abstract jargons, what are the general statements that we can make that allow us to provide some interpretation for all of this knowledge that gives us a picture of the cosmos as a whole, and that maybe sometimes functions as a critique of the abstractions deployed by special sciences in service of making room for our concrete experience, which is another important factor in our understanding of the universe. So it's metaphysics as the search for the transcendental conditions, or metaphysics as the search for the most general statements we can make, given what the special sciences have revealed. And in either case, Whitehead says, every hard-nosed scientist says that they don't like metaphysics, but what they really mean is that they don't like when their metaphysics are critiqued. They don't like when someone attacks their metaphysics. And so might metaphysics just mean making the implicit explicit? It's not adding something new to what we already know and experience and talk about every day. It's trying to dig into what we know and experience and talk about in our everyday lives to reveal the implicit assumptions that are built in. And maybe sometimes we dig into it and we realize, oh, actually the way we've been talking about this every day is inconsistent, or there are some, we're making claims that upon closer examination don't hold up. And so metaphysics then becomes a sort of practice of seeking a more coherent way of thinking about the world.
It becomes a contemplation.
A contemplative activity. Yeah.
Or a participatory metaphysics, like Jake showed in Wright.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
I like that.
Which brings in the looping effect again. We find new ways of talking about the world, which then alters our experience. And it's this continual feedback loop that is a spiritual practice.
Yeah. I also, just to just this relationship between theory and practice is an interesting one. And what is the role of the intellect in our contemplative practice?
Mm-hmm.
Because it can almost, everybody needs a different amount of that. Everyone has a different way that their intellect works and is employed in their practice. But this is more just like a question of maybe if you've thought about that at all, because it's certainly been in my experiences that I've had to learn how to, because I'm that way inclined, I've also had to learn how to use my intellect and not let it blind me further, or not get caught up in that. So in metaphysics, that is also, the distinction between metaphysics as an intellectual pursuit and metaphysics as a contemplative discipline.
Yeah.
And metaphysics as a contemplative discipline takes the intellect as part of its, encompasses the intellect as part of its discipline to deal with that as part of its encompassment, rather than metaphysics just as an intellectual pursuit, which has different goals and relies on different criteria and
I really like that distinction. So the one place where I wasn't totally happy to follow you on the way is I like the notion of metaphysics making explicit what's implicit, but I wouldn't want to rest with that notion. Nor would I want to rest with a metaphysics that only provided me the most general characteristics of things. What I hear you talking about in this sort of incorporation of the intellect into also a sort of contemplative metaphysics is the possibility of moving beyond just the search for the abstract or the general to a different mode of comportment to the world, in which the world can reveal something about itself that isn't abstract or general, but is profound. William Desmond, in searching around for the right word for this, will sometimes call it the intimate universal, by which he means not an abstract universal, not a generic concept, intimate, interior, intima meo, nearer to me than I am to myself, and nearer to everything that it is, but is also shared. So not a total, because there's all the difference in the world between that and a generic or general concept, which can be a totalizing concept. I think abstractions, the problem with abstractions, and Whitehead, you know this better than probably any of us in this room, as Whitehead says, the problem with abstractions is that we reify them and then they're destructive to us, right? We misplace our concreteness, and then that just screws everything up. Politically, intellectually, everything else. And so the real question, I think, is there a way of thinking that moves beyond particulars, or is other than particulars, maybe not beyond, alongside particulars, that's not abstraction? And that's where I think it might be the only way we can really talk about that, is to do something like Ashton was inviting us into, to think poetically or narratively or symbolically or whatever the right word is for it.
Do you guys want to respond to that or anything, or can I share?
Go for it.
Pointed to you.
Since you brought in the metaphysical section of the bookshop, which happens to be dominated by divinatory methods, I can't help but want to look at that as not a low level, right, of metaphysics. It might be packaged.
I didn't mean to imply that.
Right. No, I don't think you did, but I think that socially we are constructed to imply that. That's what you think. You think of metaphysics, you think of tarot, and suddenly we're in a denigrated position. Whereas I think when you're talking about being able to think in terms of details and not necessarily abstraction, but symbology, like that's all divination has ever been and continues to be, right? You have the intellectual side of any divination system where there's story, symbology, meaning, but then you also have the interpretive portion. And so it's like this kind of perfect blending of these two sides of ourself, basically, where the intellect has activity, has something to do, but then the contemplative part is allowed to kind of run free. And it's sort of like you get these reins to hold on to, but then you can explore all of the potential implicit and explicit, I think, experiences, right? Because you get the implied material from symbols, mythology, story, which are all part of a specific system. But then you also get explicit when you're thinking about what might be happening or coming into the field at any given moment. Looking at a bird, for example, if we think in terms of augury or things like that. And so I feel like there's somewhere where this has been kind of happening to a certain extent all along, and it's still connected to metaphysics, even if it's only on the Barnes and Noble bookshelf. But there is a kind of way where this has happened. And I wanted to kind of ask too, if it's not metaphysics necessarily after modernity or like beyond, but like before, and like there's so much more. And what has, if we kind of regress past that, modernity has kind of like owned metaphysics in a way that it doesn't have the right to own it. It's been existing before and continues to outside of the bounds of what we call modernity, which is parallel to what we're living right now and has kind of been there all along. So all of that comes up. I just wanted to give my divination plug, because I feel like people have been practicing these methods, and talk about awe and astonishment, right? Like when somebody seems to have a connection to the divine, it's a beautiful thing, and that can definitely bring up a sense of inspiration and astonishment for humans. And then just one more to kind of bring it around too, when we start to talk about the history of science and philosophy of science, if I think of like the earliest both Babylonian Roman literature would have been very divinatory in nature, and that's where all science comes from. Really, when we get down to it, that's the seed of it. And so I think science is definitely metaphysical and has probably been from the beginning, however much we've tried to structure around it and bolster it and shed it out of those associations. So.
Chad?
I was watching on YouTube, so.
Not coming late.
Not late, that's great.
And two things. You said like our implicit assumptions, and in today's world, aren't those metaphysical assumptions? Like that mechanism is the way to the truth, or that the universe is actually not sacred. That's a metaphysical assumption that comes out of our science.
Right.
And what I've been studying is looking Pauli and Carl Jung's dialogue. And Pauli was really concerned or trying to bridge science and religion, ultimately, or mind and matter, as physics and psychology. And what's interesting about that is I think the archetypal astrological perspective is a good candidate for being that neutral language that actually describes consciousness and matter in ways, and it's grounded in matter. It's grounded in the mathematical alignments of the planets, nature. And this is an empirical thing that we can all see. But what it actually does, I think, because you were talking about first-person experience, it allows insight into that. And get insight into what someone's first-person experience is like, even if you don't know them. You're just watching them on TV, you see what they're like, and you see it matched up with the archetypal characteristics of the complexes in the natal chart or by transit. So I just wanted to make that plug as well, and see what you guys have to say about it, but also, yeah, so I was thinking, like, because Pauli did a investigation of Kepler. Like when Kepler was coming up with the third law of planetary motion, it was a religious epiphany. He was seeing the mind of God. So what I was thinking is it's the metaphysical assumptions that have been there all along, but then our mechanistic viewpoint is that as well. It's a metaphysical assumption that it's not sacred and it's just matter.
Yeah.
It doesn't have consciousness.
Well, part of the issue with modern science being unconscious of its own metaphysical assumptions is not only that metaphysical issue, but it's unconscious of history in the way that these early scientists were magicians and alchemists and astrologers, and that their understanding of the divine was absolutely essential to their understanding of how nature could be an ordered system that the human mind was capable of knowing. And at some point, maybe through the 19th century, that got totally repressed, and science became something that somehow implied atheism. Whereas for the early scientists, it would make no sense to talk about a scientific picture of the universe absent a creator God.
Yeah, they were quite a lot of the founders of science during the scientific revolution as Christians.
Oh yeah.
I just want to drop one more thing in there in regards specifically to that is if we think in terms of religion as having carried the wallet for a long time, right? And if you were a scientist because you were being paid, and usually that money was coming from something that had to do with the church. And now, at this moment in time, it's become commercialized, right? And so who's got the wallet? And so if God is no longer carrying the money,
That's true.
then
It's also
we can kind of shed him.
right. I think
And now we're beholden to whatever corporations, and so we've seen that switch. But so maybe they weren't all pious, maybe they were just pretending so they could keep getting paychecks.
Like your conversation with Alan, like it seems that like from the tweeting Carpenter's perspective, it's just like he couldn't prove it. It's a matter of being able to prove it, because science like works on proof, and it's given us such power. That's what he's saying. It claims such power.
Yeah.
It just doing all these things, but how can you prove it? How can you measure it? How can you quantify it? I think that's what they need, because they're so identified with that world. It's given us such power.
I don't know at all about it. Just to make a point about how our conversation is limited to Western European science and Christianity and such, whole history of how Buddhism and Hinduism influenced science, Indian science, Jain, Muslim, Islamic science. I don't know the history of all that, but there are all those other sciences, ways of what can be termed as science, and how they've been influenced by all of these different cosmologies and belief systems, and how just bringing attention to the fact that our conversation is limited to European science, which has its particularities, such as trying to objectify the life world, which there's other sciences that have been existing.
Right.
I'm speaking way out of my
Right, but like acupuncture and stuff like that. That's based on bodily
Right.
experience.
maybe.
Yeah.
Does anybody who hasn't said anything want to ask a question or jump in?
This question's for Emily. So you had spoken about, I believe the term was microphenomenology.
No.
So it was this notion of within very acute spans of time, bringing very exhaustive phenomenological analysis as it pertains to the scientific method. If I heard properly, if I understood properly, I was thinking about what Jake brought up with Whitehead's notion of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that when we're doing science and we forget that our notions are abstractions and we reify them. It sounds like what you were getting at is in some way an attempt to get beyond that. It's an attempt to keep science as concrete as possible to our experience. So if I understood correctly, but it's hard for me to envision exactly how that plays out in the process of scientific praxis. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, the methodology, like microphenomenology as a methodology, is a way of using first-person accounts of experience in a way that that's more rigorous, but not. I see that you're speaking to the danger of then just continually verifying. But the point, what I see a lot of hope for in this methodology is that introspective reports in psychology and neuroscience have been given this air of we can believe the image of a fMRI more than we can someone reporting on what they experience. So we're giving primacy to our objectified methods, and anything that someone says that they experience, we're not trusting as much. So I see this methodology, this way of interviewing people. It's not only a way of dealing with people's reports, it's also a way of interviewing someone that elicits that doesn't sort of superimpose or create other experiences, rather reveals what is already there. So it's a very it takes a lot of practice. I've been learning the method with Claire Petit-Mangin, and I'm sort of still in the place of practicing it lots, because it is itself a practice when you're interviewing someone, not to create, just to unravel different depths of their experience that they previously weren't aware of, but the way that you ask it, they can see, and then there's a way that you can understand the language that's used, and the use of the language and the body language and the way that the gestures and all of this, in order to really integrates that the phenomenological experience of the person into the data. But then there's also, that's not going to completely revolutionize science. It also has that can change the way that cognitive neuroscience and the science of consciousness is practiced and understood. But then there's also the issue of how the general public understands science, and that is also where the reification occurs, is when people start believing things as more than they do their own lived experience, and they denigrate their capacity to intuit and to feel and to come to their own understanding, an understanding that is local and personal and only exists in that moment of revealing. And then I think what happens with science is, or even if we could even metaphysics as an intellectual pursuit rather than contemplative discipline, can also fall into this trap of coming to a conclusion that's then requires, or is requires validation from others in order for it to be for the conclusion to be validated or made, because there is a lack of confidence in one's own pursuits in that sense. The confidence can only come from when that knowledge is understood personally, and that entails a understanding of how those metaphysical conclusions or scientific knowledge is understood and integrated in oneself. Am I making any sense?
Mhm.
So there's like the whole culture. So there's neurophenomenology and microphenomenology, which I'm really excited about and want to develop in my thesis and try to work on more and figure out how that can actually really change our science of mind and how we practice neuroscience and how knowledge is constructed, and bringing in first-person lived experience into the methodology that way. And I think it's a really great way. I really like the way she's doing it. But then the other side of it is how it's internalized and understood in the general public, and that is part of the reification process, or the abstraction process, is people not knowing how to use it.
Right.
Okay?
Do you have a point on that?
I haven't heard how the microphenomenologist conceives the relationship between the subject's experience and their report of it. It sounds to me like you have not incorporated first-person experience. You have incorporated reporting. But we don't know what happens in the experience issuing forth as its expression. All of us are Ashton-like. I mean, we could mean multiple things. We don't have complete control over what we mean. And so you haven't closed that gap yet.
Right. So the gap, I mean, that's essentially the gap between
That's the hard
subject and object, and also
It's
what.
a very hard problem.
But there's also a distinction between what is being called soft neurophenomenology and hard neurophenomenology.
Yeah.
And one being such that yes, we can become increasingly detailed and refined in our understanding of subjective experience, so that our mapping and understanding and interpretation of the objective of our scientific objectification, we can like make a clear distinction. That doesn't resolve the hard problem, which is and for that, so that's so that's soft neurophenomenology, can deal with that, and then hard neurophenomenology essentially is the dissolution of the science of the subjective objective split. But that is something that the scientists themselves, the practices. So it's not, so we're talking also another point of changing the scientific culture, not only the methodology in this in the sense of incorporating first person subjective experience, also the changing the attitudes of what experience is and what science measures, and then also changing the cultivation of the scientists and how they approach science. So their own awareness of that split occurring in themselves, and that entails that the scientists undergoes some form of discipline and self-reflection as part of their
That's what Polly argued for.
this
Science
complete
to be
reform of
psychological.
every single laboratory across the world.
Stephen?
Just a very quick thing, because Claire presented and she showed videos. If we had the videos of where she takes, Millie said she'd take like what, a 5-second thing, and then she showed them, sort of hot off the press, and then people would. There was a special way of inquiring of the person themselves. You could call it leading the witness. I mean, she got a lot of blowback on exactly what you were saying. So she was sort of defending by saying, let's imagine an open mind, and maybe we're not making any claims except to say, here's some neat stuff that we discovered that you could do and maybe throw it out later. But 45 minutes, she can show 45 minutes of, it's almost like, Ramana Maharshi's, who am I? She didn't go there. But it was a kind of looping in a way. But being a neuroscientist, she could pay attention. It was all marked, and they were checking the brain, and there were all kinds of little movements. And then the interviewer could elicit a comment about, oh, your eyes moved up and to the left or something. Those familiar with neuro-linguistic programming will know something about that. But what's interesting is, it seems kind of abstract in your thing about reporting, is a critique. But she said, well, let's just kind of take a look at some of this amazing stuff. And just a final footnote, I mean, this could be seen as a micro neuro application of Husserl's Epoche. And Husserl got exactly the same blowback. It's like, come on, you think you're actually describing experience? It's like you're giving me the dream. Even Freud said that's amplification. And so those critiques are there. So she's saying, let's just go do this. We don't have to make any hard claims, except this seems like either folly or a kind of cool method to get at some material. And people who have undergone this, not so much the interviewer, although they were told apply it to yourself if you can, but the person, they've pretty much reported, maybe it was self-selecting, that this is amazing and totally cool, like I'm discovering stuff.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, and she got a lot of blowback on exactly your point.
So we can discipline ourselves to create more and more acute descriptions, and that's one way of doing science. It's kind of the idiographic method. But I've been thinking a lot about the presence of or absence of explanation in this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
We've been thinking about meaning, but it seems like meaning doesn't require an explanation, and explanation doesn't provide meaning. If this research is interesting and valuable, it will result in more acute explanations. So far, so good. But I don't see it producing meaning, which is a reconciliation of ourselves to our death. And we don't need generalities or explanations.
Wait, did you say toward death?
Toward our death.
Oh, just want to make sure.
Let me just say that as an example of what meaning is like. It's not simply a propositional situation. It's a reconciliation. And so science is a way of being progressively less wrong and having more and more explanatory power through a greater degree of simplification of one's description of the scenario one's in. But none of that is required in order to reconcile ourselves to it as
Right.
souls.
But I don't think that the claim, I feel like this, this community of scientists that are developing neurophenomenology and using it, I don't feel that it's just a different kind of, I'm not trying to explain experience. That's again taking it as an object and something to try to subject to take and make an account of. It's really just, that's why I said, like, of course it's not enough just to develop or to change the logic and language and way of doing science. It's also dependent upon how that is received in the person who's the consumer or receiver of that science. So yeah, I think I don't having met Claire and it's not trying to find an explanation or a science of experience. It's a way of exploring a whole area of human experience that has previously just been completely cast aside because it's not been seen as verifiable and real, and so it just brings, and that's why it can also be a nice experience to be interviewed, because you suddenly realize all of these aspects of things that you just are sure that you experience, but they're just all brushed aside the whole time. And so it's a sort of contemplative process in a way. And
so my understanding is that a science is thought to be more sort of established as such, as science, when it moves beyond description into explanation. Now, maybe we could attack that as a measure of scientific progress, but I have no personal reason to object to that. So if this method results in more and more acute descriptions, that's great. When it matures, it will produce explanations. And that, I think metaphysics expands the horizon of explanation. And nowhere does that guarantee any kind of reconciliation.
Right.
So yes, of course, there's new metaphysics, there's frontiers of knowledge, but there be dragons? I don't know. I mean, meaning, symbol, I don't think so. Metaphysics can proceed, it can be revived and disappoint us. We still find ourselves in need of reconciliation, which is not in metaphysics, it does not result from propositional attitudes.
I have a point on this which kind of connects back to what Will was saying, where you said in kind of no uncertain terms that the level of biology or life or human beings in particular won't fold to this kind of deterministic explanation. And I'm not optimistic that that's true. And I think because of neuroscience and because of the increasingly detailed descriptions that will become explanations, they will become explanations about what you're going to do next before you know you're going to do next. I'm wondering, is there some, what do we do with that? How does that change our ethical relation to each other? How does that change our system of responsibility if we can get to a level of, through the kind of accumulated scientific apparatus and the technology and everything and all of these methods combined, kind of puts us in a box that we can't see in our first person experience, but that can describe for us what we are going to do even when we don't know we're going to do it.
We should ban science. The church-
Well,
the church tried.
you know, that's scary, and we know that people are going to use it for manipulative ends, maybe just to sell us shit that we would never want to buy ever before, but it probably also will lead to medical and scientific breakthroughs that will alleviate the suffering of lots of people that we can't comprehend right now. But I'm wondering what you all think about this, and it's a question of free will, and is there a metaphysics of free will here, especially with the neuroscientific kind of information that we're being flooded with right now? And what happens when the description becomes an explanation? And what if it kind of explains away again at an even higher level, like you were saying? We have a new metaphysics. Hey, we're agents again. Hey, value is back. And then the dialectic churns one more time. And they say, great. We can also eliminate that level of new metaphysical speculation. Thank you. Is that your move? Is that your final move? Okay, here we go. Boom. Done.
I can't help thinking both. I mean,
I asked the question because I'm scared.
well, me too, with the use of science and technology and artificial intelligence and us losing our sense of agency to all these technologies. But I don't know I don't know quite how to articulate this, but it kind of gets back to the differentiation of a deeper understanding of really what our intellect is and how it functions. And I feel like all of these, depending on an explanation is just a tool that leads you to somewhere else. And if you don't know how to use that tool, then you're always grappling to like this explanation, and you're lost. There has to those explanations essentially end up dissolving, and there are better explanations than others, and they only serve in that particular moment for that particular person, that particular time. But it's a cultivation of yourself, of how you hold those explanations, which is the crucial thing. And so in a sense, it doesn't matter whether a description becomes an explanation, because that can exist out there. It's how you're holding it and internalizing and dissolving it, and whether it brings you closer to something real or it causes you confusion. And the only way that you can ever do that is through your own personal journey and practice, and coming to an understanding that can't be conceived of or spoke of or shared. It's an understanding that comes, and you just know it, and you're confident in that, and that's that. I just feel with both of your explanations, you're just depending too much on that intellectual, on the aspect of the intellect.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking more of like cell phones or smartphones and social media and all of the cognitive behavioral science that's been leveraged to create to addict, and the description turns into explanation, turns into technology, turns into profit for somebody. And so, and to me, I can't think of another example that people of whatever form of embodiment, whatever kind of interest, whatever persuasion, whatever life path they're on, everybody seems, for the most part, to be very equally addictable to these things. And so there's, maybe we've discovered something universal there. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not sort of worried about me sitting around, can I get a kind of transcendental critique of this new metaphysic and go like this. I'm more worried about
how it gets
operationalized. And there is a level, this is the part that scares me. There is a level where you could bait enough of these humans leveraging enough of this cognitive behavioral neuroscience to, maybe get them to forget what they're doing for 20 years. And then that
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's not. I don't see it as intellectual. I see
Yeah,
it as kind of
it
distributed.
kind of comes from the same thing though, because there are technologies that have come out, especially like electronic and digital technology and artificial intelligence has been inspired by science and neuroscience and this particular way of understanding how knowledge is produced and stored in the architecture of our brains. And we forget that every cell of our body is capable of cognizing and understanding. And so I see our technologies and our addiction to them as this proliferation of this one part of our being. And then this other aspect, which is the sensing, feeling, body. We've become so dull and unsensitive to our feeling body, and the only way to counteract that, we'll have all these technologies like you are feeling sad, like, oh thanks, like, because we don't know how we feel anymore, but it's still that our technologies have come out from our intellect in that sense, and to redress that balance is something that we just have to learn how to feel deeper and more, and how a different way of understanding comes from that. A different form of knowledge comes from that, and I'm scared of all that too. And the only way I can see a real viable pushback is just not to trust these technologies. You have those things, those meditation things that like show you how you're meditating. Why don't you just learn to meditate? Like, why do you need this like biofeedback of the technology? We're trusting the technologies and seeing them as more. But I see it as the same thing.
I think there's an issue about capping our. There is a metaphysical question that has to do with the sort of like metaphysics of the person and metaphysics of the mind, that has to do with what kind of knowledge are beings like us capable of. I was reading an article a couple days ago written by one of these CEOs of an augmented reality company, one of those things that you projected out, and he was making the argument that like what we really need is to wed our artificial intelligence algorithms to our moral decision making, because there's all sorts of decisions that we have difficulty making. And if we just had a wide enough data set of like what everybody thinks is right to do in certain areas, we could feed it all in, then we could have like an actual accurate moral judge to refer to. So you could literally be like, should I save that person? But the problem is, and here's where I think like metaphysics isn't a panacea, but if you don't have metaphysics, then you're not able to ask the questions that can allow you to question, that can allow you to interrogate some of those myths. The problem with a move like that is it's assuming that our capacity to articulate propositionally our moral decision making will allow us to produce a big enough data set that then we can plug into the really smart AI to tell us how to behave rightly. When in fact, I think, I'd argue, we have other modes of knowing the world, and especially other modes of knowing our relationship to the world along the lines of the good, the true, and the beautiful, that are not susceptible to precise articulation like that. And so that kind of AI, but only if I'm able to articulate that, can I say why that kind of AI move is both doomed to a certain kind of failure and also creepy. And that's where I think like metaphysics, recuperating you can always be bound by new metaphysics. There's a lot of shitty metaphysics out there that have hurt a tremendous number of people. But that's another way to put it would be to say, because of all the bad metaphysics out there, we need to have metaphysicians just for the very sake of contesting it.
Isn't that an issue right now, like with driverless cars? Do they have to decide like who to save in the car?
Right.
Or not?
You have to make moral judgments about whether or not they should hit the brakes.
Right.
So we have 5 minutes left of our scheduled time. So I want to know if the panelists have anything they want to share before we close.
Well, I'll try to address what you were bringing up, and I want to accede that, or I don't think that we have pure free will, that we're constantly like are free agents.
Sure.
And I think that in terms of the arguments for non-strict determinism, it's not just our current behaviors, because I think you're right, like the extent to which we'll be able to really map out the human organism or the organisms, or that limit, who knows when that will be ever reached. But I think the argument against that is better based on differences in, or the evolution of complexity. So I think it's more like once you have the human organism that's already been evolved, there's a certain amount of inertia in behavior, etc. And habit is a huge part of why anything endures. And so you can learn those habits and everything and manipulate that. But someone's manipulating that. I mean, so yes, people will be manipulated, and this is a really scary thing, but somebody's agency is involved in pulling those levers and in deciding to utilize that technology to one means or another.
This is where I'm even more pessimistic
You know?
than you would go on.
And so, okay, so you think maybe the AI is utilizing us, I guess, perhaps, yeah. But I mean, it's also a possibility for, I mean, the more that we find or discover that is part of our unconscious habits and the things that we thought we had control over that we don't have control over, at least we don't seem to. I wonder if, I mean, the opposite optimistic coin is, in some weird way, would that allow us to more fully realize, like become more realized? Because until you are aware of something, it controls you. And then once you are able to bring that into your awareness, there's a possibility for then doing something else. So, I mean, for even just our own habits, you know, like until you recognize a habit that you constantly do, it controls you. It'll just continue to happen. And once you recognize it, okay, well then there's the possibility, even though it's small, for changing it. And so, yeah, I guess there's a couple things I wanted to inject.
Of course, the conversation can continue in another format, but
Should we get in a circle instead of square?
we're going to hold hands, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Lots of uninterrupted eye contact. Could you lock the door, actually?
That's when it gets real.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone for coming. And that's it.
I think we should do this again next year.
Yeah.
The roundtable panel series.